Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get us started then, so that we can save as much time for the reading event today. Welcome to Scott Kikkawa's reading of his novel Red Dirt, an event sponsored by Bamboo Ridge and the Department of English and Applied Linguistics at HPU. Before beginning the reading, I'd like to first thank the people who helped make the event possible and helped arrange it. First of all, thank you to Dr. Micheline Sung, who is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at HPU, to Misty Saniko, Marketing and Social Media Director at Bamboo Ridge Press, who is also moderating the event today. Thank you, Misty. And finally, our reader, author Scott Kikkawa. Scott Kikkawa is from Hawaii Kai in East Honolulu and writes noir detective stories set in post-war Hawaii, featuring 442nd veteran Nisei Detective Sergeant Francis Sheik Yoshikawa. His critically acclaimed debut murder mystery Kona Winds, published by Bamboo Ridge Press, was released at the end of 2019 and spent 6 months on the small press distribution fiction bestsellers list. He serves as a columnist and an associate editor for the Hawaii Review of Books. Red Dirt is his second full-length novel, and a third is scheduled for release in 2023. Winner of an Elliott Cades Award for Literature, the New York University alumnus is currently a federal law enforcement officer and lives with his family in Honolulu. All right, thank you, welcome.
Well, thank you, Angela. And, you know, I did not have any good idea of how this format was supposed to go. But before I get into reading anything, could you tell me a little bit more about this class in detective fiction? I'm hoping that I can make this applicable.
Well, yeah, we are, let's see, it's a class that started with classical detective fiction. We really began with some of Sherlock Holmes stories. We looked at more modern adaptations, the BBC version. We moved then through hard-boiled detective fiction with Marlowe's, detective figure, and then into how different authors began to disrupt some of the more, what some critics have called sort of the socially conservative position of much of the detective fiction genre. So we were looking at what happened when diverse voices entered in and began writing, women and men of color. And we're currently reading a South African detective fiction text called Red Dust. So we're looking at what happens with it in an international scope, but we're also asking, can detective fiction do some very productive, open us up to questions of sort of political importance, a kind of political activism almost that occurs through the genre. And we will end finally with Gone Girl, looking at domestic noir. So it is a genre and gender class. So gender has been very much part of our focus, but gender in intersectional, relations with class and sexuality and race, ethnicity. And so we were looking forward to hearing you read and then maybe having some time at the end for questions from the audience. Some of the students who are in the class are choosing to do a short fiction piece at the end. So I think they're looking forward to hearing yours and maybe asking questions.
Oh, very good. I hope that then what I wrote fits or dovetails nicely into your curriculum. It was, of course, Raymond Chandler inspired. Raymond Chandler was a writer I worshipped in late high school and throughout college, and along with Dashiell Hammett, but maybe a little less so than Chandler. And it occurred to me, and there's a long story behind my first book, Kona Winds, which preceded Red Dirt, same protagonist. But the upshot of it is that for a long time, I think the hard-boiled detective genre, and many are kind enough to call my work noir, which I think is a point of controversy in some cases. But I think this genre has long been owned by like this lone wolf white guy, you know, and there were writers that started to turn that around. I think Sarah Paretsky and Walter Mosley were a couple of them, and they've done it long before I decided to do this. But I had noticed that nobody had written anything along the lines of what I was trying to accomplish, which kind of flabbergasted me. I thought that for sure somebody had already done this, and it had not yet been done, at least not the way that I did it exactly in the period with this type of protagonist. So I'm hoping that maybe all of you will get something out of it. And after I do some reading, ask me anything you want. I'm not one of those people that restricts my, or restricts questions, at least not about the process. So what I picked out is kind of short. The things I'm going to read are kind of short. And the first thing I'll read for you is a prologue. And the prologue was something that was added to my manuscript after I had completed it and turned it in for that first round of edits. I am privileged to have a really brilliant content editor, Juliet Kono, over at Bamboo Ridge, who was one of my idols, kind of growing up, reading her poetry and her prose. And Bamboo Ridge has a stellar copy edit team as well, led by Gail Harada. I think she's on this call. I see her name there. Hi, Gail. They make my work readable. I think it's so much more better than what it was in its original untouched form. One of the things that have been changed with my manuscript was the addition of a prologue. What happened with the first book, Kona Winds, is that Juliet suggested that I break off some of what was once the first chapter and turn it into a prologue. And that worked beautifully. And what happened with this book, with Red Dirt, she asked for the same thing. Can I write a prologue? Unbeknownst to her, it took me about 45 minutes to do it. And when I gave it back to her, it came back to me with very few changes. So I'm really lucky that that happened. But I'll read this prologue for you so that you get a sense of the kind of what the backdrop of the book is supposed to be. And I always tell people that I read this in what I call Detective Monotone, because it's the voice that I kind of envision this whole thing should be read in. Watched a little too much Dragnet as a kid, I think. So here it is. Spies, enemy aliens, traitors. This is what they called us to our faces. The nicer ones whispered it behind our backs. In the days after Pearl Harbor, we all did what we could to make ourselves as invisible as possible. A lot of things went straight into the trash. The Hinamatsuri dolls, the calligraphy and brush paintings, the silk kimono. Tosan even buried the swords in the back of the house under the tea leaves. Everybody stopped speaking in the mother tongue. Even the old timers forced themselves to use English. And where they couldn't, they shut the hell up. We were all trying to prove we were Americans. Dumping our sentimental ties to the old country wasn't proof enough. A lot of us stepped up and gave the ultimate proof, blood. We endured the taunts and racial slurs at Camp Shelby, then we shipped off to endure the artillery and the bayonets of the Wehrmacht. I gave my blood. Wally Yoshida gave his leg. A lot of others gave their lives. We gave everything so that everyone would leave us the hell alone. We came home to some fanfare, Fat Carnation Lay, a parade or two, luau's and speeches. Then came the new names. Stalinist stooges, communists, traitors. Blood wasn't enough to appease the gods of sugar and shipping. They didn't want sacrifice, they wanted docility. There were too damn many of us and we were too close for comfort. We asked for fair wages, They painted us red. I came back from the war and went to college in New York City on Uncle Sam's dime. There, I threw myself into Le Mort d'Arthur and learned a painful lesson about betrayal. It isn't a rejection, it's choice. Like Lancelot choosing Guinevere over Arthur, I chose my country over my friends. Traitor. In atonement, or perhaps in denial, I took up sword and shield and swore an oath to defend, a 38 caliber sword and a shield that fit in my pocket. Not for the first time, I rode out to seek the Holy Grail under the banner of a country that called me traitor. I haven't found it yet. So that's the prologue that I threw together at the request of Juliet. I'll read a little bit from the beginning of a middle chapter of the book, an early middle chapter, and hopefully this part gives you some sense of the period, especially the period here in Honolulu. And this takes place in kind of the early summer of 1953. Harry Kurita's apartment on Kapiolani Boulevard wasn't a very large place. New, it had the smell of fresh paint and wall-to-wall carpeting. The new apartment smell carried a faint overlay of black Cavendish, Harry's pipe tobacco of choice, sophisticated, worldly.
We're waiting packages. There's a little wipe for your eye if you want. Top right on the glass there. It's really red.
Sophisticated, worldly, just like the tomes on its shelves with raised leather on the spines and gold leaf lettering. The tiny parlor crammed with them. But furniture did not crowd the room. There wasn't enough space. An off-white love seat, a walnut lectern with a large volume of Keats pretentiously open to Ode on a Grecian Urn, a small coffee table piled with more old books, and a decanter of scotch were the only things in the cramped room, apart from the shelves stuffed to the gills with romantic English literature or criticisms on it. There was no radio. I met Harry Kurita in passing at a cocktail party hosted a year before by my sister Iris, a high school geometry teacher and advocate for political change. Harry was spouting some diatribe about the evils of professional sports. He stood in the middle of my sister's parlor with a martini in his hand, ranting about professional sports being a bourgeois tool used to control the masses or some such shit. He made a speech of his while I was trying to listen to a previous day's ball game on my sister's radio. I asked him to hold it down, please. Mantle was at bat at the bottom of the ninth. Harry called me a case in point and shook his head with exaggerated sadness. Iris kicked me out of her house and wouldn't talk to me for a couple of weeks. It was nice to see that the exalted Harry Kurita practiced what he preached. Or maybe he just couldn't afford a good radio like me and a lot of other people on a government salary. Besides, Harry didn't need a radio to seduce the UH co-eds he brought back for study sessions. All he needed was his magnetic personality along with the love seat and the books and the scotch. He didn't need competition from Frank Sinatra. Harry's tiny apartment was on the ground floor of the new 3-story apartment building. The exterior, done up in a brown moss rock, faced the boulevard. The building was dubbed Kapiolani Suites in modern white script on the rock wall. Ferns and tea leaves flanked the wall with a handful of black gas tiki torches skewed at stylish angles. All the new buildings were either suites or arms or gardens or manors. I guess everyone wanted to feel like their new address was swankier than the last, even though it was just as hot and miserable as the old place and a hell of a lot smaller. Only the new paint and carpet made it nicer. The new place certainly wasn't more exclusive than the old place either. In fact, it was probably much less so. Flashing my badge with a suggestion that the manager get an after lunch drink with the $1 I slipped him got me access to Harry Kurita's little love nest. Try that with any daikon cutting housewife in Kaka'ako and you're likely to end up posting bail for a trespassing charge. So that's the beginning of an interior chapter, and that's a couple of short pieces that I had to read for you. I've got a couple more, but maybe we can talk about this, or I can answer questions now.
I have a question. I'm interested to hear a little bit. Your detective figure is Detective Sergeant Francis Yoshikawa, Sheik. He goes by Sheik. He flashes his badge? Is that because he is part of the police force? He's not a detective outside of the established police force. Is that true? So, for example, Marlowe or Dashiell Hammett, Sam Spade are, professional detectives, but not part of the established police.
He is part of the established police force. He is an HPD detective with a rank of detective sergeant, and went through the recruit school, is on the city and county payroll. I think in this sense, he differs from the protagonists of writers like Chandler and Hammett, where they concentrate strictly on what they call the private detective, or
right.
the detective for hire. This is not this character. He's a civil servant and an employee of the city and county of Honolulu, and it's a little different perspective. I think that I like the idea of actually writing from the viewpoint of a police detective rather than a private detective, because there are constraints and there are requirements that are involved in that investigation that are not put on private investigators or private investigators at the time. I thought that was a more interesting perspective, and maybe in some ways one that I was a little more familiar with. So that's it. Yeah, so he is a police detective.
I find that a really interesting choice, because I wonder to what degree, he is challenged then by being part of that established force, right? Your prologue talked about the exclusion from and wanting to belong as American, and I wondered, does that play into being part of a police force, or does that change things up because it's placed in Hawaii?
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's something that maybe I try to examine throughout all of my manuscripts, is kind of that play of identity. I think, though, that it is set uniquely in the time period I chose, because it probably couldn't be set in any other time with the same issues. Certainly not today. I always tell people that there is a golden age of crime and crime fiction, and it is not today. That's because I'm in law enforcement myself, and I have a lot of friends that write in the contemporary period, and it's all fantastic stuff, but I find that I have to suspend my disbelief maybe a great deal in order to enjoy that type of story. It was an age before litigation, an age before advanced forensic science, an age where people killed each other for cash, and there were cases of mistaken identity, and cops routinely beat confessions out of their suspects. Things that kind of don't happen, or I should say, don't happen as much as it used to. Today, those practices are frowned upon and they're not commonplace, but they were at one point. And I always have to put a caveat that I don't long to go back to that era. I'm certainly glad I don't work in that environment or have to deal with people in that environment. But I think they did make for sometimes more colorful stories, especially when you put it in its historical context. So his being Japanese American and having served for a country, like others, in some cases under duress, under personal duress in a way, made for, I think, a darker and much more noir story in the post-war period, which it did with many other writers who set their fiction during this time and followed a similar theme. But I think in Hawaii we had a very unique situation, and it was a situation where we didn't experience martial law for a lot of Japanese, or we did experience martial law for Japanese Americans, but we didn't experience the internment experience the way they did on the mainland. But that made for a community here that remained largely intact, but changed. And it's almost a direct metaphor for what was going on in the mainland, but with a lot of different twists. So that's kind of why I made the choice here.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
I have a question. I know you mentioned that Chandler was an inspiration and somewhat of a role model for you. I'm curious what aspects you thought were worthy of praise, or something you wanted to recreate, or something that he presented that you wanted to combat. Because I know in our class we had a lot of conversation around the problematic areas and the problematic representations that's very present in his work. And I guess going along with that, I'm curious if there was like a sense of like justice, or was it therapeutic to contribute to that conversation in that genre in a way that has accurate and respectful representations for someone who isn't white?
Sure, and thank you for bringing that up. That's a really great point. I think that as much as I and many others admire Chandler, there's no getting around the fact that he was racist, he was xenophobic, he was misogynist, and it comes across in a lot of his writing, and that's something that can't be escaped, and that's something that I don't really. I'm not really an apologist for him by throwing out there that he was a product of his time, which I think is not an acceptable explanation. You know, even though a lot of white males of his time felt that way and felt free to express a lot of their prejudices that way openly, the people they were disparaging of the time, I'm sure, did not take it any better than they would have today. So I don't make any apologies for Chandler in that sense. What I admire about Chandler, though, was I'm not going to say the authenticity, because there can be an argument that might be made for his opinions as part of his authenticity. I don't think that candor counts. But what I most admire about him is the lyrical nature of his prose, the cadence of his dialogue, his employing of simile. He's a master at that as a tool in description, and to use that inspiration and to make it and to put my own twist on it without bringing. I didn't seek to update Chandler or to make him politically correct in my own writing, but I thought that using those aspects of his work that I most admired to inspire the type of book that I wanted to create was an acceptable way of doing that. I think that recently there has been a lot of work in the horror genre on H.P. Lovecraft, who is a notorious racist and xenophobe. And there are a lot of African American writers today that are creating works, both in multimedia and in writing, that are inspired by Lovecraft, that kind of turn it on its ear, and I don't think that using the term updating is appropriate. I think that while their work is inspired by Lovecraft, they are really taking the spirit of what he wrote and making it their own. And I think that's, in a lot of ways, that is better than correcting the original, that is better than sanitizing their viewpoint, is to take a work inspired on the best parts of that work and to make something totally original out of it. So that's kind of, when I say I admire Chandler, I admire his style, and I admire the product, which is more lyrical. And this is why I prefer Chandler to Hammett, by the way, because there is a lyrical quality to his prose, and I think it does not exist elsewhere in this genre. Um, I read a lot of Mickey Spillane, and it's quite frankly dreadful compared to compared to Chandler, and they were contemporaries. Hammett has a very spare style, and he's very good at dialogue, but he is not very colorful in his descriptions. So although I have modeled or was inspired by Hammett as well, it was less so than I was by Raymond Chandler, and that's I hope the product has turned out in a fashion where people can recognize that. But thank you. That's a great question, and it's something I've never been asked, but something I thought of very often.
We have some questions. Lauren has her hand up. Lauren, do you want to get on microphone and ask your question?
Sure. Hi. Hi from the mainland, actually. I'm from Ohio. And so I'm sorry that I'm jumping in on your class. I didn't realize that this was going to be a class, so I do apologize for that. But I saw a talk of yours a few weeks ago in which you were talking about how you wanted to discuss or expose individuals from the mainland who think that Hawaii is all this glossy, kind of touristy, glitzy thing that we see on commercials and when we go on vacation. And I really appreciated that because I'm really interested in history. And I really appreciate the fact that I'm learning so much from your books in regards to the setting, and especially with Ellen Park. I love that character, the reporter. And I was really curious, is she based on anybody from that time period? Or is it just somebody that you wanted to create?
Well, thank you, Lauren. And thank you so much for your comment about wanting to learn more than what Hawaii is presented to be for people outside of Hawaii. That means everything to me. Perhaps you should talk to the 100 New York literary agents that rejected my manuscript for exactly that reason. But Ellen Park, or the character of Ellen Park, is a very interesting story about how she came to be. In my first draft, she was an office girl. Like she worked in the secretarial pool of the state attorney general, like the victim did, and she was a co-worker. One of my beta readers, Dr. Jason Chun, who is not on this thing because he's teaching a class right now. He's at UH West Oahu. He and I have been friends since like middle school, and he was one of my beta readers. And what he told me after reading my first draft was, more than half your readers are going to be women, because more than half of all readers are women, and that's kind of like a demographic fact by default. You should really make this female character a lot more interesting. You should give her a lot more agency, and you should make her a character that has a lot more stature in the community than she does in your version of her in this writing. And you know what? I resisted him. And I told him I could not do that because I did not want to impose a contemporary lens on my version of 1953. I think that's really one of my peeves when it comes to reading a lot of historic fiction, is that a lot of authors, contemporary authors who write in a different period, tend to impose their own contemporary sensibilities on everything. They'll write in what they feel people were like at the time, what their mores were at the time when they weren't in fact different. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be as true to the period as I possibly could be, but without writing in this character's own kind of ugly prejudices the way kind of Chandler did, like we discussed in the last question. So I said, well, most of these women were office girls back then, if they worked at all. And I didn't want to professionalize her anachronistically in order to create a character just to make her appealing to a certain readership. But you know what? That was unfair of me to say, and I was totally wrong about that. And I knew I was wrong about that because the reason I had given pushback or said that was because if I had changed that character, I would have to start all over again. I'd have to go back and rewrite the entire draft that I had written. But you know what? I did that because there were many examples of women who were very prominent and very key to changing society in that period. Women here like Harriet Balsalog, the attorney, the labor attorney, women like Aquan McElrath, the labor organizer. And there are lots of examples of women like that. So I said, okay, well, yeah, I will make Ellen Part a woman like that. But you know what? I have to change everything just about. I have to go back and rewrite everything. But I did. And I'm glad that I did. I'm glad that I was called on that. Because really, I did not intend for her to be a principal character in the narrative. And shame on me, because although there, in the first person narrative, there really is only one principal character. And I choose the first person not just because I enjoy Chandler's style of narrative, which was almost always first person, except for his short stories. But his novels were all in the first person. It's also because the first person viewpoint is something of a cheat. I don't have to develop characters completely. I just have to interpret every other character in that world through the lens of one individual, and that's a narrator. So it's something of a cheat, but it's a perspective that I find interesting, and it's something that I think examines the protagonist a lot more. So all things being equal, with every other character in the book, they were just viewed through the protagonist's lens, and Ellen Part in her original iteration was no different. But she became a more integral part as soon as I changed her, as soon as I made her professional, as soon as I gave her a position. And the Honolulu Record was an actual historic publication. It was a weekly that was published by Koji Ariyoshi, who was a real life activist. And the character of Jiro Machida is in part based on Koji Ariyoshi. But he coexists with the real Koji Ariyoshi, and that's a device I employ so that I don't have to actually make real life people to demonize them or to get details on them wrong if I don't demonize them. But Ellen, the character of Ellen became a lot more interesting and a lot more integral to the narrative once I did something as simple as change her occupation, and suddenly she had a personality. Because I think in my first draft around, she had a little bit of a personality, but not much, because she didn't have many lines of dialogue either. But this was all due to the criticism of one reader who insisted that I make a change. And I resisted because I didn't want to make the change because it was too much work. But I eventually shed my laziness on that and did the work, and I am glad I did it. So thank you so much. I appreciate the fact that you appreciate that I had to go back and do everything over again.
Thank you so much for the answer. I really appreciate it. I really like that character, so I'm really glad that you pushed on.
Thank you. And by the way, she's not really based on a real life person. Not really. I always tell people that all these characters, like none of them are me, and yet they're all me, including Ellen, because I make them up and I put words in their mouth. Maybe on the surface, there may be some real life inspirations for some of these characters, but it's a very shallow thing that I draw inspiration from. It's maybe just the name or the appearance of an individual. But all the characters, including Ellen, were kind of made up creations of mine that I kind of just pulled out. And yeah, she doesn't really exist in real life. None of them do.
Hi, I have a question. So you had mentioned earlier this idea of the detective monotone. I'm one of the students who's going to be writing a creative piece for the detective fiction class, and so it's something that struck a chord with me. And so I was wondering if you would be willing to elaborate a little bit on kind of like the key, maybe technical differences between a detective monotone and say like a normal character tone, if that makes sense.
Sure. I call this detective monotone because, and the inspiration, of course, was with Jack Webb, right, in Dragnet, and what that really comes from, I think, and I think this is more appropriate for an actual police detective, a civil servant who works for an actual government police force, than it might be for a private investigator, although to a large extent, private investigator too. But what it, I think, comes from is a lot of the narrative of a police detective in some ways is inspired by the report form. So when a narrative is being given on a case, there's an official version of that. And that official version is the report. That the reports are usually bereft of any embellishment or any extraneous detail. As Jack Webb, I guess, famously is quoted or misquoted from Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am, is what most reports are in its ideal form. And it's a drier thing. And although when you write a piece of fiction, you can't ever be as dry as a real life police report. I know I've in my job, I've written a number of reports, and it is nothing that anybody will ever read for enjoyment. They are as dry and as uninteresting as they come. You want to retain some of that level of detachment and of kind of sanitized fact giving in that format without making it totally gray, like a police report. So that's the impression you get. And I think it's in the cadence of it. It's in a lot of breaking up of sentences into little tiny staccato bits where there are a lot of periods instead of commas. You'll have a short sentence period and then maybe one or two words and another period and then another sentence. I find that cadence, although it's not like a real life police report, it resembles one when you read it that way, or when you read it aloud that way, or when you read in your head that way. It sounds kind of like something done on a typewriter in that Courier font, and that's a stylistic choice. There is a lot of detective fiction, I'm sure, like traditional detective fiction, the Agatha Christie variety, where the language is a lot more flowery and a lot more colorful, and that's great for that genre. The spareness, though, is what makes hard-boiled or noir, I think, and that's kind of the choice I made in creating this narrative. So wow, that's great that that you folks are going to be doing your own pieces. That's wonderful. Hopefully you do something that's inspired by something that you're familiar with, because that's what I want to read. I want to read about a Micronesian detective or some girl out in Nanakuli who does this for a living. I'd buy that book in a heartbeat, because nobody's written it yet, and if you follow these stylistic cues and put your own story into it, I think that's what makes it a very special, unique thing. I think nothing is new under the sun, but if you take something you like, run with it, steal from it shamelessly. I think that's what I did. But I can't. Yeah, I'd love to read what it is that you're writing. Will you share a little of that, or do you have any ideas about that?
Oh gosh. For me specifically, I'm writing so it's detective fiction. And she's a Hawaiian private detective. And she is called in by like loved ones to investigate her boyfriend's polycule. Somebody was murdered in there among them. And so because she's kind of friends with them, she's been asked like by them to take the case on top of everybody else. And then that's kind of where I am.
Well, that's just great.
Yeah.
That's just great. If you can decide stylistically how you want to present that, I think that's a novel. You know, not just a short piece, but I think that idea is a novel, and you should really, really do it. Wow.
I will try. Thanks.
Hey, Scott, I think
Yes.
a good segue on that is, can you talk about how stylistically, you put Hawaii as a place into your book, and what would you call sort of a local or Hawaii style noir? Like what did you do in order to sort of create this setting of a noir Hawaii mystery?
Oh, well, yeah, thanks, Misty, for bringing that up. I think that, well, like in Chandler's world, he writes about LA, and LA as being a very noir place because, but back up a little. I know that the definition of the term noir has been batted around and argued by many, many critics. And many critics, it's a French word, and most of these critics are French, surprise, have said that the work of Chandler and the work of Hammett is not really noir, not in the way that James M. Cain's work is, for instance, is really noir, because what noir is about that that kind of loser protagonist who gets caught up in this downward swirl that eventually leads to their doom because they chase a better life by illicit or illegal means, and it never ever has a good ending. And they think that if your character doesn't experience that or doesn't end that way, then your work isn't truly noir. And they're arguing that Philip Marlowe never ends up in that situation, so it's not really noir. I would argue, though, that is noir, because while the protagonist, the detective, does not experience that kind of downfall, he or she does witness it. And you're examining that kind of human frailty and failure from the viewpoint of somebody who really analyzes it. And I think in that sense, it is noir. So if Raymond Chandler is a noir author, which I will call him one, then his examination of Los Angeles, I think, is the quintessential study in noir, right? Where it's really kind of a thin veneer of respectability over some very bad behavior. And in Chandler's Los Angeles, I think that's really embodied by Hollywood and the culture there. Chandler wrote from between the mid to late 1930s to the late 1950s, his novels at least. So they're roughly in this 20-year span, really kind of bookending World War II, where you saw the rise and the boom of Hollywood and of the film industry, and how it changed the American imagination. But the place where it was happening was right in Los Angeles. And what Chandler does is he examines that underneath all the glitz, underneath all the glamour of the Hollywood dream machine, there's a lot of sordid bad behavior. There's a lot of sex scandal. There's a lot of racketeering. There's a lot of there's a lot of peddling and money laundering and drug dealing and things of that nature. And that, I think, is the essence of noir, is to peel back the veneer of respectability and to expose the really ugly stuff underneath. And what could be more that way than Honolulu, you know, especially in the post-war period, where I think we're on the verge of tourism replacing agriculture as our primary industry here in the 1950s. This happened because of the jet age, where it was really starting in the mid 50s, but didn't really take off, no pun intended, until statehood, until 1959 or beyond, where agriculture started dying as our principal industry. But we're kind of on, you know, we're kind of on the last gasp of that old world. And there's a lot of bad behavior under it. This is why I got rejected by like over 100 New York agents, because and the one rejection that told me America is not ready to read about a Hawaii as ugly as the one you portray. And what she meant by that, and by the way, I love that rejection because it was honest and because it told me exactly why they couldn't find a vision for selling it. Because America views Hawaii as its pristine tropical playground. They don't mind if you sully Los Angeles or New York, because those places are already dirty in their imaginations, or big cities across the mainland. But Honolulu is a place where they like to envision that that kind of stuff doesn't happen. And we had a lot of stuff like that that happened in the territorial period. We had a very strange and kind of colonial racial power structure here. We had a lot of labor movements that rose and were broken until they finally succeeded in organizing, despite all their the obstacles to doing it, including the divide and conquer strategy of plantation owners. We have, and I'm examining this in my current manuscript, which uses the fledgling Cherry Blossom Festival as a backdrop. Our Japanese American community, my community, the one I grew up with, that kind of no longer exists in the sense that it used to. But gosh, talk about a veneer of respectability over a lot of bad behavior. This is a kind of a community that lives in a lot of collective self-denial and says that bad things are only done by other people, when we know that's really, really far from the truth. And Hawaii in general is kind of like that. And I think that many authors have not exposed that historically. I think we've had a few authors that have done it in the contemporary period. A few that I really admire, authors like Chris McKinney, have done a wonderful job of looking at the really dirty side of contemporary Hawaii and exposing that. But yeah, we haven't seen it examined, I think, to the extent that I'm trying to do in the territorial period. But yeah, I didn't have to do a lot of creation here or making stuff up. It was there, and it was there for the taking, but nobody had really used it. So that's kind of how, and I'm sorry, that's a long answer to how I came up with the Hawaii of my books. I didn't really come up with it. It was there. It's just stuff that people don't talk about today, and maybe with good reason.
Okay, Greg has a question about Frank the Sheik. What was Frank or his family's experience with Japanese internment camps?
Oh, okay. Well, what his experience was is the fictitious family that I created. The father's an auto mechanic, but he also teaches calligraphy at one of those mo'iliili schools. And because of that, because he's a teacher of Japanese language or Japanese language arts, he got put on the short list of local Japanese people who are slated for internment. There were a few of them, right? They went to places like Honouliuli on Oahu, and there were camps on the other islands as well. But there were those that got shipped to the mainland, the really dangerous ones, the community leaders. The fishermen, I think, were especially suspect because they owned their own boats and they had radios, so that they were in perfect positions to spy for Japan. And a lot of them were shipped off to places like Jerome, Arkansas. And the protagonist's father, Sheik's father, is on that list. I believe in this book, there are flashbacks to him in a pup tent on Sand Island, awaiting shipment to the mainland to be placed in a camp. And what happens is he gets pneumonia and dies while he's waiting for the ship. This came from, by the way, this is inspired by a real life story in my own family. I had a Hanai great-grandfather, my mother's kind of Hanai father, the Reverend Fujio, who is a Buddhist priest. And he took my grandmother in when she was young. I think she was not quite a teenager at the time he took her in. My great-grandparents got a divorce, and back then they divided the children such in those families where the oldest went with the father and the younger children went with the mother. So my grandmother was the oldest child. Her younger sister went with her mother. They had a much, I'm not going to say it was an easy life, but it was probably better than hers. My great-grandfather was something of a dissolute gambler and not very good character. So what he did was he told her to wait in the steps of the Buddhist temple and told her he'd be back, and he never came back. Pretty much abandoned her there. So she got adopted by the priest and his family, the Fujio family. And Reverend Fujio was one of those that was slated to be shipped off to Jerome. He spent the time waiting in a pup tent in Sand Island. I think there are photographs of all the pup tents on Sand Island at the time. And he caught pneumonia and died waiting for the boat. I don't have a lot of details about that story, but it made its way into my manuscript as a story of the protagonist's father. So I gave it some embellishment and some color. And that's the experience with internment with this character. I think it was important to mention, Deidre's on this call. I know we discussed this in my NVMC talk on the prior book, but there were, it was a way of calling to attention the fact that there were families here, there were people here in Hawaii that were touched by the internment experience, though it was not like it was on the West Coast, where there was a wholesale removal under Executive Order 9066 of all Japanese Americans to internment camps. Here, there were a few, but it happened to a few nonetheless, and that's that made its way into the book. But thanks for that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, if you like, I can read another short passage. This is from another interior chapter. It's very short. I've read it at other readings, but this one will hopefully give you a small sense of the dialogue in this book and how the cadence kind of is meant to flow, the rhythm of the dialogue, which is inspired in large part by Chandler and by Dashiell Hammett. Okay, so this is the beginning of chapter 11. The skinny Japanese boy with the crew cut was leaning against the clubhouse wall with a marijuana cigarette dangling from his mouth. He wore an Argyle sweater vest with a white shirt under it and was suffering for his sartorial statement, sweating like a fugitive in a broom closet. He had just finished prying the cap off a bottle of cola, the one luxury of a caddy on his break at a municipal golf course. He looked like a punk who had found $20 on the sidewalk and spent it all in the ridiculous clothes he was wearing. I joined the kid in his meager patch of shade under the clubhouse awning. The sun had begun its descent in the west, but not by much. The Alawai fairway was empty. All the doctors and dentists and insurance salesmen who crammed their rounds in the morning when it was cooler were long gone back into their air-conditioned offices. I took a cigarette out of the pack and lit up. He eyed me suspiciously as I undid the top button of my shirt and loosened my tie. "Can I help you?" he asked in a way that was not at all helpful. "I sure hope so." "Well, I'm off duty right now if you want a caddy. My break ends in 15 minutes, he said, surly and no longer enjoying his cola. "Do I look like I'm dressed for a tea time?" "How the hell should I know?" "Well, you're the one wearing the Ben Hogan getup in 83-degree weather." "What the hell do you want?" That did it. I wasn't taking any lip from a cockle punk, especially because I used to be one myself. I grabbed him by the collar and snarled, "You mean, what the hell do you want, sir? You sure say hell a lot for someone who lives on tips." The kid's eyes grew wide with fear. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, sir. No need to get violent. It's been a long day." I released my grip on his collar. "Yeah, for you and me both." I took a $5 bill out of my pocket and held it between my index and middle finger in front of his face. As I was saying, I was hoping you could help me. The kid rubbed his close-cropped head. He looked at the $5 longingly. "Sure, I can help you, sir." His manners had improved 100%. "I'm looking for Marlon Wild. He's a groundkeeper." The kid gave me a dubious look. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I put the $5 back in my pocket. "What's the matter, kid? Don't know him?" He stared at my hand in my pocket where the $5 had gone. "Are you a loan shark, sir?" "I don't want anyone to get hurt on account of my talking." I pulled the badge out of my pocket and showed it to him. His eyes got huge and he started wheezing. "I'm no loan shark," I said, "and nobody's going to get hurt as long as they tell the truth." He gets off when my break ends. He comes out this way. That's his Buick out there, the dark green one. He usually goes straight to the car," he stammered. I could see the unspoken prayer he uttered behind his eyes that I wouldn't turn my professional attention to him. "Thanks, kid," I said. I stuck the $5 in the V-collar of his Argyle sweater and yanked the reefer from his gaping mouth. I threw it down and ground it up under my heel on the asphalt. "You shouldn't smoke that shit," I told him. "Kills brain cells, and you better save the ones you have left." "Yes, sir," he croaked, then ran off and disappeared in the clubhouse without a soda. So that's like a small example of the dialogue out of an interior chapter of the book. Do we have anybody else that's working on a short piece for class? If so, I'd be really interested to hear what what you're working on.
I'm trying to see who's here from the class, but I won't speak up for them.
I'm doing a creative piece, but I'm taking a slightly different approach. I guess it's not very traditional. What I was thinking of doing was having my main character be a detective fiction writer, and she's struggling with playing into gender stereotypes or not, and how to do it effectively. And so she's having this conversation with her husband, who is mansplaining the problem with that issue. And so, yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Oh, that's great. That's like it's like a dialogue between Sarah Paretsky and Mickey Spillane. If you, I'd love to read that one too.
Well, here's a really quick question, Scott. How do you keep all the twists and turns of your plot and all the secrets and misleading directions? How do you keep it all organized? What's your technical process?
My technical process for that, I am an analog person, so my technical process for that looks something like this. It's not legible. It's barely, well, to anybody else but me, and to me, it's barely legible. I I sometimes write myself into a corner and have to backtrack quite a bit and figure out where I went wrong and what I have to change, maybe about 80 pages prior to that. It is an ugly, not very efficient process. So a lot of it is still trial and error for me. I'm not what you call an outliner. I don't outline a lot of my plots ahead of time. I've taken to making a very loose, short outline, which always changes 3/4 of the way through the manuscript, and it changes drastically. So I don't really keep track of plots. They evolve as I write. And if I write myself into a corner that way, I go back and change something. These days, and I'm in a wonderful group. I think Gail's still here. She's part of that group, the Bamboo Ridge Study Group, where I'm privileged to be in a writers group with a lot of Hawaii's best writers. With Gail, I thought I saw Daryl too. He might be here with Daryl Lum and Gail Harada and Juliet Kono and a lot of other names that you may recognize if you follow all the best Hawaii literature. Everybody there is famous except me, and but I have the benefit of submitting on a monthly basis a chapter or so. There's a limit to how much we can submit. Most of us are poets, so they don't really butt up against the limit or in danger of it. But I'm one of those guys that writes a long form, so it's usually a chapter at a time. Sometimes 2 chapters at a time, but this time I'm rather not that productive with my current manuscript. But what they do is they read your submission, and then they comment on it when we actually get together and meet for study group. And you don't really explain or defend your piece. You kind of just sit there and you take everybody's comments and criticisms, which I think is a wonderful process, and I write it all down. But I also find that when I do that, when I submit these things to study group, chapter by chapter or whatever, I don't have a lot of room for experimental error on my part. What I present to them, I think, has to be something that's at least coherent, even if I don't change it, or if I end up changing it somewhere down the road and scrapping it and starting all over again, at least for the time being when I present the thing. It has to be coherent, and it has to follow the chapter that preceded it and the chapters that preceded those chapters to a large extent, so that everybody can make some really effective comments on it. And I think in that sense, study group has changed my process somewhat. So I've tightened up the way I do things. I am not as wildly careless and unpredictable with my manuscripts as I used to be, and then having to go back and cross everything out and start all over again. By the way, I do this in fountain pen, so it's not a very clean job. I get ink all over my fingers, and but less so today, because now I've got other people reading it, and I think that's a wonderful thing. But that's I don't chart everything out like I should, like I do in my real job. I put together these I2 graphs that are full of criminal organizations and who's the head of what and who they're married to and what corporations they sit on. But I don't do that for my writing for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe it would help me a great deal. But for now, it's kind of allowed trial and error and writing myself into a corner and writing myself out of that corner somehow. In other words, Misty, it's an ugly, not very effective process.
Thank you. I think it's good for all of us to hear that you've grown, and there's more than one way to do this, you know?
Yeah, probably a lot more effective ways than what I'm doing.
I'm interested in the research process, how much research you do. Having placed this in the 1950s, is there a lot of time spent with the research of the piece before you start writing?
Yes, on my first book, Kona Winds, I spent 2 months researching prior to starting the manuscript with Red Dirt. It was something similar. But I'm finding with each subsequent book that I have, right now I have 2 out, the job of doing that gets easier because it opens doors for me. I see Deidre and Melanie from the NVMC today, and they were wonderful in opening up their archive for me.
Okay.
You know, like
Yeah.
I got to read a lot of primary sources, among them transcribed oral history interviews of veterans from Maui.
Yeah.
The Sugar Museum at Pu'unene was closed on the Friday I arrived there, but they actually opened just for me. And I thought, wow, this never happens. You know, this would have never happened on my first book because I have not published anything, and anybody can say they're writing a book. But I did. I think that visiting places is a very important part of my research. A lot of it is academic. I think I read about 7 books for Kona Winds, and I read maybe 3 or 4 for Red Dirt. Dr. Bill Pewitt of UH West Oahu, who runs the CLEAR, the Center for Labor Education and Research, opened up the CLEAR collection for me. He let me into the CLEAR archives and let me handle whatever I wanted to handle. And that included things like a legal pad that belonged to John Reinecke with his handwriting on it, you know, his handwritten notes. I didn't have any white gloves that I took in with me, which I should have, because I was handling primary source material, you know, ILWU meeting minutes and things like that. And it's that kind of research that really is instrumental in putting me in the period. Photographs, I think, are very important. I love looking at photographs of the period. I had this discussion with Wing-Tech Lum about how looking at photographs and images really give you confidence as a writer, even if you never reference those images or use them in your manuscript, because it gives you a very clear mental picture of what it is you're writing about, especially in the period, right? You have a very clear idea of what people wore, or what buildings were there or not there, and what cars looked like, and how many people were around, and things like that. The photographs are invaluable for that, and I got to look at the Bishop Museum archives and the state archives for photographs, and also the research came in the form of anecdotal research. I talked to my mother, of all people, and there's always a hazard there, you know, like once you ask her to start talking about something, about herself or her past, that could be a 5-hour-long conversation without any breaks. And I tried to keep up and write as much as I could, and eventually she'd repeat herself. But to talk to people who lived through the period is also an invaluable resource. And a lot of research always goes into this, because I want to get the details as accurate as I possibly can. And all sorts of experts have now allowed me to avail myself of their expertise. I'm meeting Wendy Tollison, who is a historian with the Honolulu area rapid transit people, who is going to talk to me about Chinatown and Japantown from about the turn of the last century to 1960, and try to pick her brain on those things. But yes, today I drive around town all the time and look at buildings and say, well, this was here, this was here, this was here, but that wasn't here. So I look at everything differently. I just kind of wish people still dress that way, you know.
I think I saw a picture on a site somewhere, but I don't know if you were standing in front, but it was the old police building that's still downtown on the, you know, closer towards Ala Moana Boulevard, I guess. Is that where your detective figure is working out of, that building, which I don't know what's housed there now? It's something to do with the state, but is no longer.
Oh yes, that's a Walter Murray Gibson building. It still
Yeah.
says Honolulu Police
Yeah.
on the arch above the foyer, which is in that Spanish Art Deco style, right?
Yeah.
Just like Honolulu
Yeah.
Hale, and with that quarried red stone and timbers imported from the Philippines, and all that mosaic work and Spanish tile in the lobby. It's a wonderful building. I think today it houses the city's taxation department,
Mm.
but the receiving desk is still there. That stairwell with wrought iron railings and Spanish tile is still there.
Mm.
You can still see the Hawaiian dredging building across Bethel Street from that large window in the stairwell. And it was very atmospheric, and they let me like walk around the building, and take pictures and stuff. So that was instrumental in my putting together of the first book, as was the Alexander and Baldwin building. The people in there were extremely helpful. They gave me literature on the building and its design, and let me walk around and take photographs. So that's that's what I love about doing this research is actually getting to these places and getting a sense of how much space there was. Placing yourself in the foyer of the Walter Murray Gibson building will give you a sense of just how claustrophobic it would have been if it was crammed with drunks and prostitutes and other people waiting to be booked, and how uncomfortable, and that makes its way into my writing. But I enjoy that so much. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for speaking to that.
A question about your use of dialect or pidgin, that you were interested in publishing nationally. How do you address the dialect and code switching of your characters?
Thank you for that question, because it's something that I made a conscious choice about. My work is not written in pidgin, but I like to say the pidgin is implied in the dialogue. The reason I did this was really for a handful of reasons, but one of them is that I do not do it well enough, like my friends and idols at Bamboo Ridge, like folks like Daryl Lum and Eric Chalk, that they really have the cadence down, and I don't think that I can do that very well. And hand in hand with that is I don't think I do it well enough not to have it come off as condescending in a way. I really hate when I read, especially books set in the American South or places like that, where they try to write in the dialect that the people are speaking, and it just makes them sound cretinous. I think it's much better. Like I liked Charles Portis's True Grit, because a lot of the accent or the dialect was implied rather than out and out written. So that's kind of how that was a conscious choice I made. It was also to make it a little more accessible, although I never really cared about accessibility to the point where I was willing to italicize all of the non-English words. That was a conscious choice. We did make a conscious choice not to italicize Hawaiian words, not to italicize Japanese words or Cantonese words or Ilocano words or Portuguese words, because in Hawaii, those are not foreign languages. We did, however, italicize Latin, and we italicize medieval Italian, because those are foreign languages here. I think that, it's something of a cop-out to say that I write to the human experience, so that no matter where you're from, you should be able to figure that out when you read my stuff. I know that there's a certain extent of alienating people that are not very familiar with the culture, with the language, with the people here, But that's a choice I'm willing to live with for a certain amount of authenticity, is to write as if the reader is as familiar as I am with the narrative, because I think readers everywhere are smarter than writers give them credit for. I think everybody can figure out things by context. I think there's a movement that's afoot that is doing just that now, with a lot of indigenous and other writers of color. I think about Cunos Diaz and Brief Life of Oscar Wilde, where he does not italicize or explain any of the Dominican Spanish that's in his text, and that readers will figure it out by context, even if they don't read or speak Spanish. I'm hoping to a large extent that readers have figured out what I've written without me having to explain. That being said, I have a good friend, Dr. Jason Chun at the UH West Oahu, who has graciously put together on his own time a study guide and glossary for the first book, which we hope to make available on Bamboo Ridge's site soon. Right now, Dr. John Rosa of UH Manoa is reviewing it. He's a territorial expert, and we wanted his take on that work before we posted it. And that's how that evolved or came to be. I don't think I made a conscious decision to write for the people here and not for the people outside of Hawaii, or vice versa. I think I wanted to write something that was an authentic narrative, and to have the reader, no matter where they're from, figure it out by context. Because I've read other works, Henry Chang, a detective fiction author I much admire from New York City, wrote a series of books about a Chinese American detective in Chinatown in New York, where he would explain, he'd italicize every Cantonese term he put in there, followed by a comma, and then the English definition of that term. Guaylo, comma, white devil, period. And while he did a fairly good job of it, and it doesn't seem to break up the narrative that much, it's a little annoying, kind of in retrospect, to say, well, why did he even have to do that? Why was that necessary? And maybe at the time, sadly, in the 80s or 90s when he wrote it, it was necessary, or his publisher felt it was necessary. But thanks. I hope that kind of answered your question.
I think we're at about 3:15. We might be losing some of our audience, but I do see that Lauren has a question, and maybe we can see that as the final question for today, Lauren.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm sorry. So I appreciate you shoving us directly into the narrative. I really appreciate that. And I like being able to figure things out by context. Sorry about the light. But I was wondering, have you considered perhaps having perhaps a bibliography in regards to your research for those of us who are very interested in the history and don't have access to the history very easily? I mean, I'm in Ohio, so like I have no history out here in any place but Ohio. So if have you considered perhaps a bibliography of some of the resources that you've consulted?
I think that maybe that would be unusual for the type of book that Bamboo Ridge Press puts out, but I was hoping to put something like that up on my website, which doesn't exist yet. I'm kind of working with James Charisma of the Hawaii Review of Books, and that's his forte, is to create things like websites. And James and I were going to create a website for me where I would post things like that, a list of resources, maybe with hyperlinks, if that's possible, and a bibliography of a lot of the texts that I use in order to do my own research, and a bunch of photographs that that I can use and not get sued over. But that's yet to be. But do watch the space. Hopefully, fingers crossed, sometime before fall or something, we will have something up. I should remember to push James on that. But yeah, that was my solution for that. And it would include things like maps. You know, I think if we can get permission to use a lot of the wonderful maps that I have used, 1956 Honolulu, and how that has changed over the years, but what it was representative of when I wrote, and that going along with photographs and things, and a bibliography of a lot of most of the works were. It's really thick academic language. I will confess I had not a very easy time getting through some of these texts, but you do get the gist of them after a while. You settle in, you stay awake through a lot of the theory, and you cut through to the to the primary sources that they consulted, and it becomes a very interesting read and rabbit hole that you go all the way down after a while. But yeah, do watch for that, because I don't believe in concealing any of that stuff. In fact, if I can encourage people to do a lot more reading on Hawaii's territorial period, good and bad, I think that I will have accomplished a large part of what I set out to do. So thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. I appreciate actually that you're considering putting up maps and you're talking about photos, because I admit I'm lazy and I did not go looking for photos of these places that you talked about. So this would actually be really cool for me. So thank you.
Yeah, well, yeah, from one lazy person to another, that's that would be my gift to your convenience. Yeah.
When Scott's website comes up, we'll be sure to promote it via our social media, etc. So you can make sure you follow us, and then we'll let you know when his stuff gets up there.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Scott, for reading and talking with us today. It's just been such a pleasure to hear this discussion. I'm thinking of all kinds of ways that if I ever get a chance to teach this class again, I'll be integrating this into the course next time around. And thank you also, Misty, for helping to put this together. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And Scott, most of all, thank you to you for today.
Well, thank you, Angela. And wow, to be required reading for anybody. I can die. Yeah.
It feels like such an absence, really, in the class after listening to you talk today. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Angela, and thank you, everybody, for attending.